Hey everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at this, which is Nvidia's GT430. Now, you'll also find this rebranded as the GT530, GT630, and one version of the GT730 as well. In particular, the 128-bit DDR3 version of the GT730 is actually the GT430. Now, this graphics card is now near 12 years old, and I managed to pick it up for just over a tenner here in the UK. So to find out how it performs in games today, we're going to be running a few games, but before that, let's take a bit of a look at some of the specs. The Fermi-based GT430 used the codename GF108 graphics chip, the same as found in the GT420, 440, 530, one version of the GT630 and one of the GT730s as well. There are more detailed specs on screen just now, but the basics of it in its GT430 form are a core clock speed of 700 MHz and a shader clock of 1400 MHz. This particular GT430 comes equipped with 1GB of DDR3 memory, running at 793 MHz on a 128-bit bus. There is technically support for up to DirectX 12, although it really only supports up to DirectX 11, as it lacks support for many DX12 features. OpenGL 4.6 support is there too though, for any games and programs that need that. Video output-wise, the 430 has VGA and DVI connectors, as well as a HDMI port. The HDMI port in particular means the 430 could also serve as a pretty cheap video adapter for media center PCs. And speaking of price, on its launch nearly 12 years ago now, the GT430 would have set you back $79 US, or around $100 US today, adjusting for inflation. The Adventure Pal, a 2018 game developed by indie studio Massive Monster, is the first game up today. I like including this one in particular as it is one of my favourite games and not many people actually know about it either. It's a simple game, graphics settings wise. The resolution is fixed and there aren't really many settings to change, and the game runs on pretty much anything, as the GT430 is showing here. There were no issues throughout the test, and even in the third area, which is more graphically intense than the first two, graphics card usage never really went over 85%, as you can see up in the corner there. So all in all, a pretty good start for the GT430. Next up is Crysis, the original version from 2007. A game notorious for how hard it was to run at the time. This is also a game I'd never actually played through myself until earlier this year. I wasn't expecting much here, but it was actually quite a surprise how well it ran. Medium settings with low object, shader and water quality were used, at a resolution of 1176 by 664 in DirectX 9 mode, as the default DirectX 10 mode has some issues in Windows 10. I've also capped the frame rate to 60, as running it higher than this I've found can cause noticeable stuttering. From the very start, up until around the Luzca's Call area of the first level, performance was great, apart from a few minor hitches. An explosion that happened during the firefight just before that area caused FPS to dip to around the mid-40s momentarily. Later on in the level though, performance is again mostly really good, except for on a few occasions. Namely the bit where you talk to Prophet after Jester's body is discovered. I think the smoke in this scene causes it, but FPS drops to the low to mid-40s with pretty stuttery camera movement. And later on, the fire at the fuel station near the school can cause noticeable stuttering and slight input lag with the mouse when next to it. Other than that, though, performance is generally pretty decent overall. The third game in today's tests is 2012 CSGO, which isn't exactly a favourite of mine, let's just say, but it is still pretty popular 10 years on nonetheless, remaining one of the most played games today. The lowest settings are being used here at 1176 by 664, with Uber shaders left on auto. I'm also running the test in a bot match on the Mirage map, so expect possibly lower performance in online matches. Other than some very slight micro stuttering on one occasion, and dips to around the mid-40s in the equipment shop, and when you're around your teammates and enemies, the game again ran pretty well. The frame rate usually sticks to around the low 80s to well over 100 FPS. Possibly the most surprising game in the tests today was GTA 5. the PC version of which released back in 2015. The lowest settings at 720p were used here. Performance overall was actually really good. Throughout the city, FPS was generally in the mid-30s to high 40s range, depending on the time of day. The further away from the city centre you are though, higher in that range the FPS tended to be. We saw frame rates in the 50 to mid-50s range in the desert area, but this could dip to around high 30s at points in Sandy Shores itself. One point where performance was noticeably bad though was in the multi-storey car park where you go as Franklin for his first assassination mission. FPS here dipped into the mid-20s with noticeable micro-stuttering too. Other than that though, performance was quite playable overall, and dropping the resolution a little using the frame scaling option would also help out in harder to run areas. Lastly, before we give overclocking a go, is Skyrim. Specifically the original unmodded 2011 release of the game, and not the remaster. 1176 by 664 is being used again for the resolution, with the lowest settings preset and high textures. The game, other than some VSync issues, which I'll get to in a bit, ran great. There were one or two quite minor hitches on the run through the woods heading towards Riverwood at the start of the game, and a few within the village itself as well. The issue with VSync I mentioned though comes from the game's forced use of it. The problem it causes, at least when you're using a 60Hz monitor that is that when the processor or graphics card isn't quite powerful enough to keep the frame rate in at least the high 50s, the game can then rapidly dip to 30 FPS and back. This causes pretty noticeable micro-stuttering in the Riverwood Trader, and a few parts of Bleakvol's Temple as well, such as when you go into the first puzzle room there. Other than that though, the game runs great elsewhere, and as you'll see in a bit, overclocking pretty much eliminates these problems. So, let's do some overclocking, see what we can get out of the GT430. Recently, I started using the Unigine Heaven benchmarking software for this, and what I do is by using MSI Afterburner, I'll set the clock speed I want and see if it passes a run of the benchmark, and if it does, I'll keep increasing the clocks until it doesn't. I do this firstly for the core clock, then the shader clock, and then the memory. One thing to note with the GT430 though, is that like older Nvidia graphics cards, the core and shader clocks are locked in a ratio of 1 to 2 with each other, so the shader clock needs to be twice whatever the core clock is. All of that aside, final stable clocks achieved here were 900 MHz on the core, meaning 1800 MHz on the shader, and 937 MHz on the memory. I ended up dropping the core and shader clocks down to 886 and 1772 MHz respectively though, as the games weren't stable with the higher clock speed. So, let's see how the games perform now. The GT430 already ran the adventure paths with no issues, so the overclock made no difference here at all. So let's get on to something a bit more graphically intense. Crysis performed noticeably better than it did pre-overclock. The main issues were dips in FPS to around the mid-40s during the firefight at the buildings here, just before the Loskas Call area of the first level. FPS here now only dipped to the mid-50s with no noticeable stuttering either. The stuttering around Prophet after Jester's body is discovered is now vastly improved as well. It's still noticeable, but nowhere near to the extent it was without the overclock, and again, the frame rate sees a little boost into the 50s as well. The fire at the fuel station near the school though still causes dips to near 40 FPS, and some slight but noticeable input lag with the mouse as well. There were no other issues, and overall the overclock makes a huge difference, and there's nothing stopping you dropping a few more of the settings to help out with the remaining issues as well. The CSGO did see a bit of an improvement, although not much of one. The FPS no longer dipped as hard as it did pre-overclock in the shop menu and around your team base or enemies. But other than that, performance was basically the same, at least to my eyes anyway. There was still the odd occasion where you would notice some slight stuttering like before, but the maximum FPS was now getting to near or even over 150 frames per second, although on a 60Hz monitor like the one I use for benchmarking, you're never going to notice that anyway. Frame rates across the map in GT5 saw a boost. Driving throughout the city now saw FPS in the mid-40s to the low 50s, again depending on the time of day. with the low to mid 50s being seen the further away from the city centre that you get. The Sandy Shores area could still have dips to the high 30s, although tended to hover around 45 FPS. Elsewhere in the desert area though, 50 to just over 60 FPS was the norm now. Performance was also now noticeably better in the multi-storey car park from Franklin's first assassination mission. Although, to be fair, this was at a different time of day with different weather, so that could also be why performance was better here. Overall though, despite the increase in frame rate across the board, there wasn't really much of a visible improvement in performance. And lastly, it's back to Skyrim, and as I mentioned before, the overclock pretty much eliminates all of the issues we had. There could still be the odd minor hitch now and again, although all of the issues with stuttering caused by VSync were now gone. The overclock, thankfully, had now made the GT430 powerful enough to maintain 60 FPS pretty much constantly, meaning no more rapid dips to 30 FPS and back to 60 like we had before. This isn't an issue exclusive to Skyrim though, as it can happen in other games when VSync is enabled too. You can also disable VSync through the game's configuration files, although that might be a bit too hacky of a fix for someone just wanting to sit down and play a game. There is also then the potential issues with in-game physics if you do that as well though. So to conclude, the GT430 actually performed surprisingly well in the tests today. In particular, Crysis. I wasn't expecting it to perform as well as it did using medium settings. But yeah, overall, for older games, I think like GTA 5 and back, it's definitely still going to be of decent use if all you want to do is just play the games. You are going to want to shoot for 720p and possibly a bit lower, maybe even a 4x3 resolution, if you're okay with that. And low settings too, although for older games, you are going to be able to up the settings a bit. It would also be of good use for sort of more modern indie titles as well, as you saw with the Adventure Pals, which at the point of recording this is only 3 years old. But yeah, as I mentioned before, the benchmarks, the 430 would also serve pretty well as a display adapter as well. If all you want is a really, really cheap graphics card that has an HDMI output for a media center PC. So if that's your intended use case for a PC, then you could certainly get away with only a GT430 for that. So hopefully you've enjoyed my little look at the now near 12-year-old GT430, which, as I said, is also a GT530, 630 and one version of the 730 as well. I'd like to finish off by thanking Patreon supporters Shadow in the Void, Mattis Derak and Jimmy the Bantam. If you would also like to support me in creating these videos, you can do so at the links down below. You'll also be seeing a list of my other patrons on screen about there right about now too. So yeah, that's going to be it for the video, so hopefully I'll see you in the next one.